Thank you. I wanted to explore first with you, Dr. Scissors, this notion of free trade and in particular imports. So I get resistance from people who believe that free trade is a destroyer of American jobs. Now, obviously, free trade has to be fair, and there are rules that are important because, as you've just described, one scenario of not exactly on point, but you've described a scenario that's a one-way street, right? Our values of openness allow them to invest, the Chinese to invest here, but when we try to reciprocate, there are all kinds of impediments to that, and that's always been a challenge for us on multiple fronts, including on the trade front. But in specific on the issue of imports, there's this idea that imports into the U.S. in and of themselves destroy American jobs. But in your written statement, you have outlined why, in fact, that is not potentially the case, that in fact there are also jobs created through imports from offloading. Could you just elaborate on that more? Because that's an issue I get a lot when I go out and talk about the need to expand trade opportunities, not just with Asia, but with the entire world. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the benefits that imports, obviously we want to be able to export too, but the benefits that imports have for American jobs, particularly stable middle-class jobs?
Yes, sir. I would be happy to. I think this is an important point. This is not to say that unfair competition doesn't exist and the Chinese don't subsidize their firms and these are things we shouldn't fight. But I do think that people forget that imports are good for us. They're good for us in a number of ways. I talked about the electronic supply chain. Not only do we all have good quality phones in our pockets, hopefully turned off, and some people have big flat screen TVs at home that are incredibly cheap. So that's nice for consumers, but it also saves money and creates resources that are available for other things in the American economy. Clothes used to be a big part of Americans' budget. We're all old enough to remember that. They're not anymore. Consumer electronics are a declining part of America's budget. That money goes for individuals and for the country as a whole to other things, including job-creating activities here. So there's an indirect effect. When you don't spend as much money and as many resources on things that you can import well, you have those things, those resources available for what you do extremely well, which in our case is high-tech manufacturing, agriculture, and so on. There's also the direct effect that you refer to, which is imports don't magically appear. You don't say something's produced in China or elsewhere, and now I have it in front of me. It's shipped, it's offloaded, it's transported within the country, it's sold, it's marketed. All those create jobs, and then I'll give you a specific example. We found that the number of jobs that are supported just by Chinese shipments of clothing from China is larger than the number of jobs supported by the U.S. textile industry. So I understand people's concern about unfair competition from countries. That exists. There's no denying it. But it isn't the case that imports necessarily cost jobs. There are certainly examples where imports, in fact, create jobs for the U.S.
So just to describe the supply chain for this phone for a second, right? It says here it was designed by California, but assembled in China. So somebody built this phone over there. And then they had to ship it here. They had to offload it at a port of entry. Those were American jobs. Then it had to be transported from the port of entry to a distribution center. Again, another set of American jobs. And then from that distribution center, there were jobs there. They were shipped out to the retailers, another group of American jobs. And then at the retail level, there's somebody selling it, another set of American jobs at the retail level. And then whoever buys these things is paying less than they normally would, which means whatever money you're saving on this, the difference between how much it would have cost to do it somewhere else and do it where it's happening now and what you actually paid, that difference is now available to spend somewhere else because you didn't spend it on this. Is that an accurate description of how it plays out?
A better one than the one I gave yesterday.
Well, then let me just ask one last question. I don't know if you know the answer to this, but my guess is that all of those jobs down that supply network that I've described probably pay better than some of the people that were building this.
Right. That's a good point to elaborate on. We have kept the higher value-added jobs here. And to even extend your supply chain further, the design doesn't occur here and then suddenly the phone's in China. We actually have production that routes through Japan, Taiwan, Malaysia, Korea, various of our Asian partners, and then the assembly occurs in China. Right. The assembly of the phone is not such a great job, and in fact the Chinese have very significant labor problems connected to some of those jobs.
Because their wages are increasing and it's forcing it to go elsewhere?
Because their wages should be increasing and sometimes they're not because the conditions aren't very good. The better jobs associated with consumer electronics, far better than in China, are here. And what we get is a trade number that looks like we're running a consumer electronics deficit with China, but we're getting better jobs than they are out of it.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Mr. Goodman, in your testimony, you talked about something I thought was interesting, and that is a notion that you said it was recently popular, until recently was popular in Beijing, that TPP is part of an effort by Washington to contain China. But in fact, if they decide not to participate in free enterprise, in free commerce, and free navigation, and the benefits of this sort of barrier reductions, that's a decision they've made to contain themselves, right? I mean, this is not, my understanding of the region is that most, if not all, of the countries would like stronger integration with China, but on a set of rules based on freedom and freedom of commerce and freedom of navigation and mutual reciprocity on rules, et cetera, and not on a set of rules that China would like to impose. So really, the ones, to the extent that there is anybody excluding anyone, it's Chinese policymakers that have decided to potentially exclude themselves from this and other arrangements because they don't like the rules. The rules they want are actually much more one-sided, to the benefit of China and to the detriment of their neighbors and perhaps the rest of the world.
Thank you, Senator. That's, I think, absolutely correct. I think that the notion of first of all, of somebody trying to contain China economically doesn't make any sense because everybody wants to engage with them, and so I think there was a misunderstanding. In fact, TPP was designed to do the opposite of excluding them, which is to pull them into this global rules-based order, and frankly, make them follow the rules of the road that we have helped champion for half a century. And so this notion was never made sense in terms of U.S. strategy. And yes, you're right. On China's own side, it was only about a year ago that they were continuing to say this, we don't want these rules. We don't want to be part of this system. And then I think what happened, as I say, I think the big change was Japan joining TPP, because now you've got the third largest economy in the world, a major competitor for them, economically and strategically, joining this agreement. And it becomes suddenly an agreement that has large heft. And frankly, is the place in the world, frankly, I'm sorry, but it's not Geneva where the rules are being written. It's in TPP where the rules of the international trading system are being written. And China realized this and I think said, we've got to be part of this rulemaking exercise, whether we're in TPP, which may be challenging, frankly. I'm not sure they're ready to reach the kind of standards that are being negotiated in TPP. But if not, they need to find another way to match this. And that's why I mentioned the Shanghai FTZ. That's why I think it helped drive a very forward-leaning reform package at this third plenum last month. It's why they're willing to talk about a bilateral investment treaty, and it's why they're talking more positively about TPP. So I think, yes, I think they themselves were their own worst enemies in this area, and I think they've figured out that this is not the right approach, and they've changed course.